Washington Journal continues.
Our guests now are Sarah Sparks, who is an assistant editor at Education Week, and Christopher Swanson, who is editorial projects vice president at Education Week. They're here to talk about corporal punishment in public schools. Thank you guys both so much for being here this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah Sparks, I'd like to talk with you. Can you summarize what you all found in your recent research on this issue in Education Week?
Sure. We found corporal punishment was a lot more prevalent even in 2016 than we thought previously. The most recent federal data shows that more than 100,000 students were spanked, paddled, otherwise physically disciplined. And that was in 21 states.
And how does that differ from the number of students or the number of states we've seen in the past?
Well, it is on the decline, and a pretty strong decline. Back in 2000, you'd see more than 300,000 students being disciplined in that way. So even in states that still allow it, it's shrinking.
And Christopher, can you tell us a little bit about how you all conducted this research? How did you define corporal punishment, and how did you determine what states and school systems were using it?
Right, so we are looking at a federal database that's collected by, the acronym is OCR, that's Office for Civil Rights, as part of the U.S. Department of Education. And it's a census of all public schools and school districts in the country, and so we're drawing on this big federal database, which has been going on for a while, but one of the nice things about this resource is that it's expanded over time. There's more schools involved, there's more different kinds of information being collected, and so we use the most recent data that's available, which is the 13-14 school year. And so we went in there and looked at incidences of it's numbers of students who were reported to have received corporal punishment, and kind of as Sarah suggested, that's any sort of use of physical discipline. It could be spanking, it could be paddling, it could be caning, in a disciplinary context in schools. And so there's data on this. We kind of look at that across the country, and the results are really kind of striking. As Sarah noted, it's been really on a decline. In the past 15 years or so, nationwide, the incidence of corporal punishment has declined by about 2/3, and so that's a big difference. Even so, and because this is, for many people in the country, this would be an out-of-sight, out-of-mind issue, and so when you do look, people will be surprised that it still happens in 21 states. As a matter of state law or state policy, states are all over the board, actually. There are 15 states that allow corporal punishment. It is permitted. There are 7 states that don't say one way or another, so it's allowed, but they don't have a particular law on it. The majority of states, though, prohibit corporal punishment. And so when you look at where it exists in the country, it's not everywhere. There are 21 states where it happens. The prevalence of corporal punishment in those states varies tremendously, from more than half of schools and students in that sort of context to very small fractions of a percent. The states where it happens most and where the most students are affected tend to be in the South, the Deep South, really kind of running all the way from Arizona through Texas, through the Deep South, into the Georgias and Carolinas. That's kind of really the core of where this happens now, and culturally where it's been the most prevalent in the past.
And we're showing now a map to our viewers of which states do allow corporal punishment. You can see that the states that allow it are there on your screen in yellow. Within each state that does allow corporal punishment, how is it determined which school systems then might use this disciplinary measure? Sarah Sparks.
It ranges wildly from state to state. In many of the states, they allow their school districts to decide one way or the other. And for example, Mississippi, more than half of schools do use it. But the differences in how they use it, what grade levels are paddled or spanked in one way, how many times they can hit a child per session, all of those are different from school district to school district, state to state, sometimes individual school to school.
Are there any best practices when it comes to corporal punishment, or any regulations around it?
This is one of the concerning things we've found about corporal punishment is there is virtually no training, very little guidance, very little legal accountability for this practice. Sometimes the people that we spoke to said that they learned how to do it either because they were paddled as kids themselves, or they watched the predecessor principal or teacher do that. So we didn't find any actual training.
We want to let our viewers know that they can join in our conversation with Sarah Sparks and Chris Swanson of Education Week. Here's how we're dividing the phone lines for this segment. If you support corporal punishment, you can call us at 202-748-8000. And if you oppose corporal punishment, the line for you to call is 202-748-8001. Another interesting finding in your research was that there was some evidence of racial disparity. According to the story, you wrote that both white and black students are more likely than students of other races to attend a school that allows corporal punishment, but black students are disproportionately likely to experience physical discipline. Chris Swanson, can you talk a little bit about some of this disparity that you found?
You're right. That's one of the fascinating things about this. When you look within those 21 states where it occurs, it's not everywhere, even within those states. The schools where corporal punishment tends to be used, they tend to have higher percentages of white and African American students. They tend to be have higher levels of poverty. They tend to be located in rural environments, and they also tend to be smaller. And so part of this is just what part of the country this tends to happen in. It's more likely to be kind of rural communities and small towns, and that's part of it. But the student demographics, though, are quite striking. And so the two groups that are most likely to be in schools with corporal punishment are African Americans and white students. But it's a little bit of a flip story when you look within those schools at who actually experiences corporal punishment. And there you have some kind of very interesting over and underrepresented groups relative to those schools. African American students are highly overrepresented within the schools. They are more likely to be in schools that have corporal punishment, and within those schools they're disproportionately likely to receive it. It's the opposite for whites. Whites are less likely to receive corporal punishment in those schools. One thing that's not really kind of in this report, but which is quite striking, and this will not surprise anybody who kind of thinks about our stereotypes of corporal punishment and who receives it. But male students are actually among the most highly overrepresented groups. Male students make up about half the student population, but they make up about 80% of students receiving corporal punishment. And so males are overrepresented among recipients of corporal punishment, females are underrepresented. And so it's a really different story, and so your likelihood of being exposed to an environment that uses corporal punishment depends on your poverty level, your socioeconomic and racial background, and then also whether you yourself will experience it. It's also very much tied to those factors.
And Sarah Sparks, you mentioned that there is no guideline or best practice, as we said, for corporal punishment. What is some of the range of punishments that your research and your reporting uncovered?
Well, it's a very subjective range. Corporal punishment has been used for everything from talking in class, being tardy for class, bringing your homework in late, up to more severe things like bullying or fighting in the halls. And we've found it across the board. When you look at what it seems to be being used for and what the administrators say they're trying to do with it, what even people who are against corporal punishment say the schools are using it for, is as an alternative to suspension. It's, we'll get the kids in, give them a couple of whacks, send them back to class. And it's seen as a way of keeping kids in line and yet in class. But the range of disciplines that it gets applied to are as varied as the school districts that use it.
Let's turn now to the phone lines. Diane from Albuquerque, New Mexico is our first caller, and she's calling in opposition of corporal punishment. Diane, good morning, and what's your thought?
Good morning, and thank you very much for having this discussed. I've always wondered why adults spend so much time thinking about how to deal with corporal punishment instead of being creative with our children. Why can't we come up with adults that think about ways to help instruct a child when they have done something wrong rather than to punishment for what they have done wrong?
All right, that's Diane from New Mexico. Let's hear from one more caller, and then we'll turn to our guest, John from Tullahoma, Tennessee is calling in support of corporal punishment. Go ahead, John.
Yes, I support it, but I could also make a good debate to oppose it as well. I think it's probably good up to a certain age, and to maybe up to third or fourth grade, you know, and even then, I think as far as the teacher, principal, who's ever giving punishment to the kid through a spanking, I think you got to limit the number of spankings like to 3. And then it depends on the teacher principal that does it. If the teacher principal has a health problem, disability of some sort, physical, you know, they should not be given a spanking, let's say, you know, because they could miss and hit the child in the back, sternum, and cause a disability and put the school in a bad situation. And that could be. So like I said, I'm making more reasons not to probably oppose corporate punishment. So you principal, and like you said a while ago, based on the training, if there's not more training than that, there should definitely be some, at least an hour or 2 hours training. My dad was a teacher, and they had in-service training. A lot of teachers did where students didn't go to school. And surely someone can give 2 hours training on how to conduct that. But like I said, after the age of 4th grade, I don't see corporal punishment doing any good, just
All
like
right.
parents.
All right, that's John from Tennessee. Sarah Sparks?
Well, we found corporal punishment through every grade, from kindergarten all the way up through high school. So there wasn't a limit in what ages received it and which ones didn't. But we do have about 50 years of research now that shows it's not associated with the outcomes that educators generally want it to be associated with. There was a really big study that just came out this year from the University of Texas that found it's associated with higher degrees of long-term defiance, aggression, mental health issues, lower educational outcomes for these students. Now, granted, the researchers are not randomly assigning kids to be paddled or not paddled, but they are able to do some very strong comparison groups to make sure these are very similar students and look at their outcomes over time. And across dozens of studies, they're not finding good outcomes for these kids.
Just to pick up on that, you know, as Sarah mentioned, this happens at all grade levels. It happens just as equally at all grade levels. About 5 to 6% of students in the elementary, middle, and high school levels receive corporal punishment in schools that use it. So it is very widespread, and so there is not much kind of isolation amongst certain age groups. You know, picking up on Diane's point about don't we have more creative methods to, you know, kind of shape student behavior, I think one of the important ways to think about corporal punishment, what we're finding here is in the context of the larger discussions that have been underway for the past few years about school discipline more generally. The thing that viewers are probably more used to hearing about zero tolerance discipline policies, and that is kind of very strict following of rules that would remove students either from the classroom or from the school, suspensions, expulsions, for a disciplinary infraction. One of the concerns about that has been not only are students receiving a form of discipline that may not be effective in terms of addressing the behavior, it also at the same time removes them from a regular learning context. And so you're out of school, you're not learning, you're at home, you're in a detention room, and it's a double whammy. You're kind of getting it both ways. And so it's part of the kind of rationale in favor of corporal punishment is that you can just get it done with and the student can get right back to the classroom and keep on learning. So that's kind of, you know, one of the pro-cons there. But there are a lot more, especially in the past you know, 5 or so years, much more prevalence of other approaches that are restorative justice, positive behavioral approaches that really try to address the behavior, very much also keeping in mind not wanting to remove students from that learning context.
And can you briefly define restorative justice and positive behavior intervention, I think it was?
Yeah, do you want to, Sarah?
Sure, I can, and I can actually give a great example of this. Restorative justice is when the student is, rather than having an abstract punishment for a misbehavior. They actually have to do something that makes it up to their presumable victims. So if they were making a lot of ruckus in class and making it hard for other students to learn, then they might write an apology to them or help read with little children or something like that to make it come home to them what they've done. And positive behavior interventions and supports, or PBIS, which is getting a lot more popular right now, is a method of giving each student a plan for what their discipline should be, trying to catch them doing good, and also sort of ramping up discipline as it goes. And one of the districts that we looked at that had higher rates of corporal punishment during the 2013 year, they had adopted PBIS and a number of these other disciplinary practices because they were a little concerned about how often that corporal punishment was being used. And it has cut their use of corporal punishment more than fourfold. So this can be a good alternative when districts are interested in lowering their rate of corporal punishment and when they sort of sit down and have a discussion about it.
Let's hear from Charles in DeRidder, Louisiana, now calling in support of corporal punishment. Go ahead, Charles.
Yes, I'm 70 years old now, and I put in 34 years in the public schools as a teacher in math and science from 4th grade up through 12th grade. And in our Bible, which a lot of people think that all religious books can compare with our Bible, but the Bible says foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction, that doesn't mean to beat him to death, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him. And we do it out of love. I know when they took our boards away from us, I'd been teaching for about 12 years, and you didn't have problems. You took care of it right there in front of the whole class, and he sat right back down. You went on with your lesson. And you very, very seldom had to whip. But when you did, you took care of him. You didn't put up with all this stuff that they're putting up with today. And the Bible also says that if you don't love him, you won't whip him.
All right. That's Charles from Louisiana. This story in ABC News, in some U.S. schools, resistance to ending corporal punishment. So Chris Swanson, in some places this is very much sort of entrenched part of the disciplinary system.
Right, it is. It's been used for years, as kind of Charles mentioned. You know, he had a long career in the schools, and it was just kind of the way they did business. And it is also a practice that is kind of culturally entrenched in, you know, certain parts of the country as opposed more so than others. And that, you know, these are public schools we're talking about, the reflections of the communities they are located in and the students and families they serve. So that is part of it, and it's interesting to think, kind of given the caller's experience, norms change. Norms are different across different regions of the country, and they change over time. We can think of any number of social issues that now are not too controversial, but kind of, you know, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, some issues may have been virtually unspeakable. I think corporal punishment, you know, may be a little bit like that. There will be people who are surprised that it still happens in schools at all, kind of given their own experience and kind of how schools operate in their parts of the country. And there will be others that, you know, kind of think it's perfectly fine. But when the caller kind of mentions the kind of public aspect of some, you know, administration of corporal punishment, and what happened in public in some places, what happened kind of privately in other situations, as Sarah mentioned, the way this is administered and regulated is just all over the place, and there's really a lot of local discretion, like a lot of things having to do with schooling. I think will be kind of good to remind ourselves just what the overall, kind of sentiment in the country and our culture is about corporal punishment, whether at schools, whether in families. It's just not the same as it was 20 or 30 years ago. And so, whereas it may have been a different experience for a child who have been, punished in school, when I was a kid, when Charles was teaching. But it's a very different experience, I think, potentially today when, we didn't do public opinion polling about this, but we do cite some kind of trending on this. It is much less acceptable in the view of the public to, whether it's families kind of spanking their children or teachers and other education professionals administering corporal punishment. It's just not as acceptable as it used to be. And that context, I think, is part of the experience that a student takes in when this happens. Some students will be very impervious and, to this sort of experience, and it won't affect them greatly. Some students, it will be very damaging to them, and it'll be something that is traumatic to them, and part of that is potentially the shaming aspect of this and the stigma that is attached to this in some places.
Here are a few thoughts from Twitter. Students can't touch each other like a hug, but teachers can beat kids. What kind of world is this? Another person tweets, if kids are not getting discipline at home, they're not going to act civilized at school. No amount of talking to will change that. Let's get to another caller now. Susan from Clarksville, Tennessee is calling in opposition of corporal punishment. Go ahead, Susan.
Good morning. I'm 53 years old, and back in 4th, 5th grade, it was a private school, but for some reason they gave me an assignment to do 16 pages on communism, and we didn't have computers back then. We had to go to the library and several pounds of books, and my mother thought it was ridiculous because she thought I was too young for communism, but I ended up only getting 6 pages, and that was not acceptable, so I was whacked 10 times with a board, and I swear it haunts me to this day. There was a witness, the assistant principal was standing there, and as I was getting the whacks about the 4th one, I started to run down the church aisles because in my heart, I knew it was wrong. But I came back and finished. When I got home, the blood vessels in my rear end and back down my legs were broken. And my mom and grandmother got together, and they didn't have a clue on what to do. They were just, do we call the police? No, we can't call the police. It's the pastor. But it haunts me to this day. I would love to take Patrick Meningay and bend him over the pews and whack his behind a few times.
All right, that's Susan from Clarksville, Tennessee. Sarah Sparks.
Well, that sort of goes to the point that we found over and over again. The administrators that I talked to who use corporal punishment, they were operating in good faith, and they thought, like the educator we spoke to before, that this was a good disciplinary practice and would help the kids grow up to be good, strong members of society. But it is very, very easy for the wrong degree of pressure, the wrong angle, the use of something that is 20 inches long on a kid who's 60 pounds. All of those things can make it much more likely that a student is going to be seriously injured. And that could be emotionally or physically. And what we found is the situation your mother and grandmother were in at that time, that's still the situation today. Because the last Supreme Court ruling on corporal punishment was in 1977, and the court rulings since have really not favored parents or students, even in some pretty severe cases of corporal punishment. Going to the hospital, being out of school for weeks, having serious injuries do not mean that you're likely to win in court. So there isn't a whole lot of legal recourse if something goes wrong.
As part of your research, you guys spoke with a student named Trey Clayton, who described an instance of being paddled when he was an 8th grader in 2011. Here's a little bit of the interview that you guys did.
Just like any other day, I'm in trouble, my buddy's in trouble. So we're talking, the librarian start, telling us to hush. I just had something smart to say back. And, but I know I was gonna get paddled. I chose paddling, so I get 3 licks. He starts escorting me to class. We walk out of his office. I went to walk around him and just woke up on the floor. I felt something in my mouth, and I hold my hand out just see what it is, and I start spitting out teeth, like shards of my teeth. I've done bit through both sides of my tongue. I've got 1 tooth already missing, and my jaw's broke. And my mouth stayed wired shut for 6 weeks.
And that was a little bit of an interview that Education Week did with Trey Clayton. Sarah Sparks, what happened in this student's legal case? What was the conclusion, and what lesson can other parents draw from that?
Well, he and another student who was also suing at the same time for a corporal punishment incident did not win. And the school had paddled Trey several times in the past. He didn't have a problem with it. His mom, when they called, she said, go ahead and do it and send him back to class. That's something we've found in many, many lawsuits, that a student comes in, and when they come in, they either choose to be paddled, or their parent says, go for it, please do, and get them back to class. And it doesn't take much to have something go a little wrong, and something bad can happen to the kid. He is now, he sort of disconnected from school a bit after that, both because of the paddling incident and the injuries after that, and the lawsuit, and eventually left school entirely. He's now back at college pursuing a nursing degree, but it took him a while to sort of come back around to being invested in education. And that's something that's a risk schools take in using this discipline.
It's a really compelling story, and I would encourage the kind of viewers to take a look at this on edweek.org. There's a longer account. In some ways, I think it is the perfect cautionary tale for these issues, because this young man, this is a student who had experienced corporal punishment before. Prior to this experience in the 8th grade, it hadn't seemingly affected him very much, and the family was supportive of getting the discipline done with and sending him back to class. And so that's some of that kind of pro-corporal punishment kind of argument we heard a little bit earlier. On the other hand, it does not take very much for something to go wrong, and you just never know. And so this was, a incident of corporal punishment that went very much awry and resulted in not just some severe physical injury to the young man, but also his disengagement from education, which was very much opposite of what the kind of pro-corporal punishment logic would kind of want to happen. And so I think it's interesting. A couple of the callers earlier mentioned, if we're going to do this, it should be trained, it should be kind of administered very carefully. At the same time, and that's in a profession that takes its education and its ongoing training very seriously, and it's in a country that is very risk averse, that's very litigious, and so it's interesting to think about why a school would open themselves up to that sort of risk in this day and age if they didn't have to, because one little tiny thing can go wrong, and it can really kind of seriously kind of sidetrack a person's life, and it can, really kind of bring a lot of kind of controversy and a disturbance to a school.
Next caller is Camille from Dunalon, Florida, calling in opposition of corporal punishment. Camille, good morning.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for taking my call. So I believe with I believe some parts of what both guests are saying. It is cultural. I myself, coming from Italian immigrants, migrating to the United States, pride was a very big issue. 6 children. Okay, so fear was instilled. Where do you go as a second grader with fear of home and fear of school, fear of church? Everything was fear, fear, fear. In 5th grade and 6th grade, 3 black children in my classroom. 5th grade. This haunts me to today. The teacher got upset with one of the children. He came from a large family of 11 children. Nice kid. And he needed a little extra attention. And she said to the children, to the one boy, if you don't stop acting up, I'm going to ship the 3 of you back on the next boat to Africa. Well, by the time we got back from recess, the school was closed and the picket started. All because a teacher, and she was single, she had no children, okay, and she was known to be have these outbursts, okay. It goes on and on and on. To me, what I'm trying to say is some teachers know the material, but not all can convey the message, okay? Most children today, they don't suffer from fear. They have what I consider entitlement.
All right, that's Camille from Florida calling in opposition of corporal punishment. Let's hear from one more caller, and that'll be Paul from Nottingham, Maryland, in support of corporal punishment. Paul, what do you think this morning?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning, go ahead.
Your show today and the guests that you have on it are part and parcel to the problems that we now have throughout society. Teachers are not supposed to be social injustice correctors. They're supposed to be teachers. If you have to spend time continuously sending the same child out of class over and over and over and over again, at what point does it stop? We can sit around with our heads in the sand and avoid the issue. The issue is the lack of civility in our society today, from children's disrespect for their own parents and themselves to adults' disrespect of the law system and the court system. And so we can sit there and boo-hoo and use our little studies and pick out 1 or 2 or 3 or 200 incidents over a period of time that involves thousands, maybe millions of students, and say, oh, this is terrible because of this incident. This is terrible because of that incident. That's easy to do. That's what most people who make their living doing studies like the 2 people you have on, that's what they make their living off of.
All right, that's Paul from Maryland. Sarah Sparks?
Right. We want teachers to be able to control their class and help all students learn. That's something that the research shows corporal punishment might not actually do. In fact, there was another separate study on the use of training teachers and students in how to respect one another, how to talk to a student who is causing misbehavior and doing it themselves. And they found that over time, the students who felt that their teacher respected them, you mentioned respect, they had far fewer incidents of problems in the classroom. They were more engaged in class. The teachers felt more respected. And so it's not so much that we're trying to talk about teachers not having control of their classroom. It's more looking at what the evidence says is the more effective way of getting control of the classroom. And I think it's a case in point that most states in the country don't allow corporal punishment, and their students are not more likely to be running wild in the halls.
Chris Swanson, one interesting point is not just the type of discipline that is required in some schools, but how parents can potentially opt out of that disciplinary measure if they do not agree with it. What are the options for parents that you guys found?
It's very much like what we found in general about the kind of regulation of this practice. It's just all over the board. There are some states that allow parents to opt out. There's some that don't. There are some states where parents can opt out, but it doesn't have the full effect of the law, and so it can be overridden in effect. And so if you're a parent in a state where corporal punishment is allowed, it's probably good to understand kind of how that works and kind of what your rights as a parent are or are not. It's interesting, Paul's comment and kind of Sarah's response about maintaining a kind of orderly environment in the classroom is extremely important, right? It's very important for all students to be able to learn in that kind of setting. And there are a number of different kind of ways to maintain that kind of order in student discipline and focus and engagement in the work. And so the question here is not necessarily whether, that corporal punishment is good or corporal punishment is bad. It's the larger question about what is corporal punishment intended to do, and if it is to provide an orderly learning environment, starting with that question, what's the best way to do that? There's evidence that suggests corporal punishment may not be the way to do it, and there's kind of other approaches that are out there that also need to be looked at in this larger context. Schools are not car engines, or they're not a mechanical machine. They are social systems, right? Students are people, teachers are people, and how students learn and experience their world is very much rooted in social and cultural norms and structures. And so, and again, when you look at the prevalence of corporal punishment over time, it's clearly declining. Public opinion and views of corporal punishment in and out of school have very much changed. And so the question about what is an effective way to maintain discipline and order within the classroom, that changes over time. And it's not a law of physics that is immutable, for all time. It is very much what is effective given how students are raised, how teachers are taught to teach, and what experiences students bring into the school from outside the school in their communities and their families. And I think that is part of how we have to look at corporal punishment. Corporal punishment, it may kind of work in a certain way now. It may have worked in a different way 50 years ago.
Go ahead, Sarah Sparks, briefly.
Well, I also found there was a lot of conflict in states within state laws and policies on corporal punishment. For example, Texas, and it was not the only state that did this, it allowed corporal punishment and is one of the higher prevalences of corporal punishment. But their Child Protective Services and their foster system required foster parents to opt out and have an annual written statement to make sure foster kids were not subject to corporal punishment in school. And their reasoning was that it could damage their ability to trust adults. They could be have trauma in their background and therefore would be more prone to again trauma from this. And that was kind of an interesting contradiction that we saw in a number of states that had these, because the populations, if you're in higher poverty schools, you might be more likely to be in a school that practices corporal punishment. The same challenges that kids are coming to school with that might make them more likely to be disciplined in the first place could also make them more vulnerable to potential negative effects from one discipline practice or another.
Let's hear now from a few more callers in our final minutes in this segment. Let's hear from Ann in Sugar Grove, North Carolina, calling opposition of corporal punishment. Ann, good morning.
Hi, good morning. I thought you took the last call, so I'm really happy to be on the air. So thank you for C-SPAN and especially for Washington Journal. The young man in the documentary film, the paddle he was holding, is that the paddle that was used on him? And the woman in Tennessee that called in about being, I think her corporal punishment happened in maybe the 70s or something like that. There's a documentary film called Women in Black, and it's about the nuns that beat children in Catholic schools, which I went to a Catholic school in the North. We had corporal punishment, kind of just horrible. I'm kind of nervous. And it just brings up a lot for me. I was never hit at school or beat at school, but I was at home. And just there was a headline this morning. I didn't have a chance to look into the article more, but because I'm busy watching Washington Journal. But that South Carolina security officer that slammed a female student to the ground while she was in her desk, no charges. So for me, I feel like, well, if that's going to go on, we're never going to have a Supreme Court rule anymore.
That's Ann from North Carolina. And just a note for our viewers that the paddle that was shown in the video was not the paddle that was used on the student who was punished in Mississippi. Let's hear from our final caller, and then we'll get our guest's last thoughts. Richard from Ottawa, Illinois, is on the phone line calling in support of corporal punishment. Richard, go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. I grew up in 50s and 60s and went to a private school. And yes, we got paddled and we had nuns, but we had respect for these people. The public schools, they have no respect for their teachers. Their parents are no good, and the public schools should have a dress code. It's just absolutely baloney about these public schools.
All right, that's Richard in Illinois. Chris Swanson, your final thoughts on Sarah Sparks as well.
One point I'd just like to leave folks with is a couple numbers, and as a researcher, if I don't speak a couple numbers, I'll get my card taken away. So in schools that use corporal punishment, the rate is about 6% overall. It's highest for African Americans at 9%, males at 8%, and students with disabilities at also at 8%. So I think one of the things we want to think about, and research can be great at pointing to challenges and some nuances, but I think we need to kind of go further. And so it does appear that certain groups are overrepresented. The question is why? There's some of the callers kind of brought up kind of anecdotes that suggest there's some cultural bias or racism in some cases. Whether that's behind it, what we're seeing in the data or not, we don't know, but I think it's a warning flag. And when you do see these disproportionate rates, we as citizens and school leaders need to take a closer look and understand why exactly that's happening.
And I would just say this is a very emotional issue in education. I mean, the very sense that this isn't something that has a lot of formal guidelines and training. One of the things that sort of came out in talking to people is it's something that is done because it's been done, and talking about it can be an uncomfortable thing. So I think that schools that are interested in doing this, it's worth having a conversation about why and what you hope to achieve.
Sarah Sparks and Chris Swanson from Education Week, thank you both so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Alon.
And coming up next,